All right, today we are going to dive into one of the most famous and, let's be honest, one of the most unsettling experiments in the history of psychology. It's a study that uncovered something really profound and kind of terrifying about human nature and our deep-seated need to obey. It really makes you ask a tough question. How far would you go just because someone in charge told you to?
So I want you to picture this. You've just signed up for a psychology experiment. You show up at a university lab and you meet two other people. There's a researcher, looks official in a gray lab coat holding a clipboard. And then there's another volunteer who seems to be just like you. The researcher explains that the whole study is about punishment and how it affects learning. One of you is going to be the teacher and the other, the learner.
You draw slips of paper to decide rules, and you're assigned to be the teacher. The other volunteer, he's the learner. You watch as the researcher straps electrodes to the learner's arm, and he casually mentions that, while the shocks can be extremely painful, they won't cause any permanent tissue damage. A little unsettling, right? Then the researcher leads you into the next room, and you sit down in front of this impressive, kind of scary-looking shock generator.
So, the test begins. Every time the learner gets an answer wrong, you have to give him an electric shock, and you have to increase the voltage each and every time. At first, it's nothing, just a little buzz, but then the voltage starts to climb, 75 volts, 90. Then, at 120 volts, you hear the learner shout over the intercom that the shocks are actually really starting to hurt.
You deliver the 150-volt shock, and suddenly the learner's shouts become frantic. You can hear him clearly. "That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please. Let me out." You pause, you look at the researcher, but he just calmly tells you to continue. So, you ask the next question. The learner mumbles a wrong answer, and you press the switch for 165 volts.
The sounds coming from the other room are becoming just unbearable. You can hear him writhing, shrieking, kicking the wall. At 300 volts, the learner screams that he's not going to answer anymore. You turn to the researcher, but he insists that silence has to be treated as a wrong answer. And so, you keep going, relentlessly, up the voltage ladder. At this point, you have to be wondering, what kind of person would do this? You know you're a good person, right? You're not some kind of monster. So why are you still pressing that switch? What kind of power makes an ordinary person keep inflicting this much pain on a total stranger just because they were told it's their job? Okay, so let's pull back the curtain here, because the real experiment was never about memory or learning at all. The truth is, the learner was never in any danger. The shocks were completely fake. The person you heard crying out in pain, he was an actor. The entire setup, from top to bottom, was a deception. The real subject of Stanley Milgram's famous experiment was always the teacher. It was you. And the real question was this: how much suffering will an ordinary person inflict on someone else simply because an authority figure orders them to?
And the answer is, well, it's profoundly unsettling. In the main version of this study, a full 65% of participants, I'm talking ordinary people just like you and me, obeyed the experimenter's commands and kept giving shocks all the way to the very end of the board, a switch clearly marked 450 volts.
And here's what's truly staggering. This result was so far from what anyone expected. Before the study, Milgram actually polled a group of psychiatrists, and they predicted that only a tiny fraction of 1%, the most sadistic people out there, would go all the way. The reality, as we see, was something else entirely.
So the takeaway here, in Milgram's own words, is this: it was never about cruelty. The people pressing those switches, they weren't sadists. They were literally sweating, trembling. Many were begging the researcher to let them stop. But in the end, they still obeyed. The main finding was our astonishing and deeply ingrained willingness to just do what we're told by authority.
Okay, but you might be thinking, how can we be so sure it was about the authority of that researcher in the lab coat? Well, Milgram was a clever guy, and he ran several variations of the experiment to really nail down that exact variable. And this one variation just illustrates the point perfectly. When an ordinary person, a fellow volunteer, was the one giving the orders instead of the official researcher, compliance didn't just drop, it plummeted all the way to zero. Zip. Not a single person administered the shocks when told to by a peer. It was all about the authority of that lab coat and clipboard. So how does this actually play out in the real world? Because this isn't just about science labs and old experiments. We are constantly surrounded by symbols of authority that can trigger that exact same automatic obedience.
Yeah, we're talking about the simple mental shortcuts our brains use all the time. Think about it. Titles like doctor or professor, they just automatically make us more likely to accept what someone says. Clothes are a big one. A police uniform or even just a sharp business suit can make us way more compliant. And then there are the trappings, a fancy car, expensive jewelry. These are all just symbols, and they can be easily faked, but man, do they work.
This happens because, really since we were kids, we're taught that obeying authority is the right thing to do. And most of the time, it's a useful shortcut for getting by in the world. But here's the downside. We can slip into what psychologists call a click-whirr mode of thinking. The symbol of authority, that's the click, triggers an automatic response, that's the whirr. And we just stop thinking for ourselves. You see this a lot in places like hospitals, where deference to doctors is absolutely ingrained.
And that brings me to this true and kind of hilarious case that was reported in a medical journal. A doctor needed to treat a patient's ear infection. So on the prescription, he abbreviated right ear to read, place in our ear.
Well, the on-duty nurse, seeing the order from the doctor, the ultimate authority figure in that situation, didn't even question it. She read our ear as rear and proceeded to administer the eardrops rectally. I know it sounds absurd, but it's a perfect example. When a legitimate authority gives an order, our own critical thinking can just switch off.
So this all brings us to the most important question, right? How do we protect ourselves from this powerful automatic tendency? How can we avoid mindlessly following orders that might just be flat out wrong?
Well, the trick isn't to just reject all authority. That would be chaos. It's learning to recognize when to follow and when to, push back. And we can do that by asking ourselves two really simple questions. First, is this authority figure truly an expert in this specific situation? And second, how truthful can I really expect them to be? Like, what are their motives here?
That first question forces us to look past the symbols, the fancy title, the uniform, and actually consider their credentials. An actor wearing a lab coat on TV is a symbol of authority, but he's not an expert on medicine. And the second question makes us think about their motives. Is there something in it for them if we comply? Asking these two questions together helps shift us out of that automatic click-whirr reaction and back into conscious, critical thinking.
And really, that's the ultimate lesson from Milgram's work. It's not that people are inherently evil, but that we are all inherently susceptible to authority. The experiment is just this powerful reminder that the most critical moment isn't about defiance, it's about reflection. So the question I'll leave you with is, when the pressure's on and some authority figure gives you a command, will you remember to stop and ask why?